Al-Shabaab didn't expect Kenya to cross the border with tanks, jets, and a clear objective. And when it did, the war in Somalia stopped being just a counterinsurgency and became a regional conflict with consequences that still shape East Africa today. This is the story of why Kenya's intervention mattered, how the Kenya Defense Forces altered the battlefield, and why their presence forced al-Shabaab to adapt in ways that still define the group's strategy. By 2011, Somalia had already endured 2 decades of state collapse. Al-Shabaab controlled large swathes of territory, taxed populations, ran ports, and financed itself through charcoal exports and smuggling networks documented by the United Nations Monitoring Group on Somalia. The group was not just an insurgency anymore. It was a proto-state with revenue, governance mechanisms, and regional ambitions. Kenya was already feeling the pressure. Cross-border kidnappings, attacks on tourists in Lamu, and incursions into northeastern Kenya had become increasingly frequent. According to Kenyan government statements and reporting by Reuters at the time, these incidents directly threatened tourism, foreign investment, and national security. For Nairobi, this was no longer Somalia's problem. In October 2011, Kenya launched Operation Linda Nchi, meaning Protect the Nation. It marked the first time since independence that Kenya deployed its military in a full-scale external combat operation. This was not a symbolic move. It was a calculated gamble. What followed fundamentally changed the war. Kenya's entry into Somalia altered the dynamics in 4 key ways. It internationalized the conflict, it disrupted al-Shabaab's economic lifelines, it introduced a more professionalized military force into a battlefield dominated by militias, and it reshaped regional security calculations from Mogadishu to Nairobi. Let's start with the moment Kenya crossed the border. Unlike previous foreign interventions in Somalia, Kenya entered with limited but defined objectives. According to statements from the Kenyan Ministry of Defense and analysis from institutions like the International Crisis Group, Nairobi wanted to create a buffer zone in southern Somalia, secure the border, and weaken al-Shabaab's operational capacity. Kenyan forces moved into Jubaland, a region critical to al-Shabaab's survival. This was not accidental. Jubaland sits astride key supply routes linking Somalia's interior to the Indian Ocean. Control this region and you control logistics, taxation, and access to international smuggling routes. Al-Shabaab understood this immediately. Before Kenya's intervention, Al-Shabaab had used ports like Kismayo as economic engines. The UN documented how the group earned tens of millions of dollars annually through charcoal exports, sugar smuggling, and taxation at checkpoints. Kismayo was the crown jewel. The KDF made Kismayo a strategic priority. With air support, naval blockades coordinated with international partners, and ground advances supported by allied Somali militias, Kenyan forces pushed south. In September 2012, Kismayo fell to AMISOM forces led by Kenya, a turning point acknowledged by the African Union and the UN Security Council. This single event had outsized consequences. By losing Kismayo, al-Shabaab lost its most lucrative revenue source. The UN monitoring group later reported a sharp decline in the group's centralized income streams. This forced al-Shabaab to decentralize financing, increase extortion, and expand external operations to compensate. This is one of the most underappreciated impacts of Kenya's intervention. Many analysts focus on territory, but insurgencies survive on money. When Kenya cut off al-Shabaab's access to the sea, it forced the group to become leaner, more ruthless, and more asymmetric. Suicide bombings, high-profile attacks, and operations inside Kenya itself increased after 2012, not because al-Shabaab was winning, but because it was adapting. This brings us to the second major shift Kenya introduced: professionalism on the battlefield. Somalia's conflict had long been defined by irregular forces. Clan militias, warlord armies, and poorly coordinated units dominated the landscape. Even AMISOM contingents varied widely in training, discipline, and operational effectiveness, as noted in multiple reports by Human Rights Watch and the UN. The KDF stood out. Kenya's military entered Somalia with centralized command, combined arms capabilities, and a functioning logistics chain. Nairobi believed that a friendly, semi-autonomous administration in southern Somalia would act as a buffer against al-Shabaab. Whether this ultimately strengthened Somali federalism or undermined Mogadishu's authority remains debated by scholars, including those at the Heritage Institute for Policy Studies in Mogadishu. What is not debated is that Kenya changed the operational environment. Al-Shabaab could no longer mass forces in the open. It could no longer rely on predictable revenue streams. It could no longer operate with impunity near the Kenyan border. So the group changed tactics. From 2013 onward, al-Shabaab increasingly targeted Kenya itself. The Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi, the Impeketoni attacks, Garissa University, and later Dusit D2 were explicitly framed by the group as retaliation for Kenya's presence in Somalia. Al-Shabaab said so in its own statements, monitored by Site Intelligence Group. This is where critics argue Kenya paid too high a price. There is no denying the cost. Kenyan civilians died. Security failures were exposed. The emotional and political impact was immense. But strategically, this is also evidence of pressure. Insurgent groups strike externally when they are constrained internally. This pattern has been observed in conflicts from Afghanistan to Iraq, and counterterrorism scholars frequently point this out. Al-Shabaab's attacks in Kenya were designed to force a withdrawal, undermine public support, and demonstrate relevance. They failed. Kenya did not withdraw. Instead, it doubled down, formally integrating its forces into AMISOM in 2012, giving its intervention international legitimacy and shared operational burden. This integration meant Kenyan troops operated under African Union and UN mandates, aligning Kenya's actions with broader international efforts. Regionally, this mattered. Kenya's intervention signaled that Somalia's instability would no longer be tolerated as an isolated problem. Ethiopia, Uganda, and Burundi had already contributed troops, but Kenya's entry reinforced the idea that Somalia's security was directly tied to regional stability. Now, let's talk honestly about limitations. Kenya did not defeat al-Shabaab. No single actor did. The group remains resilient, adaptive, and capable of lethal attacks. Somalia's political fragmentation, corruption, and governance challenges continue to undermine long-term stabilization, as repeatedly warned by the UN Secretary-General in briefings to the Security Council. But that was never Kenya's job alone. What Kenya did was change the cost-benefit equation for al-Shabaab. It forced the group to fight on multiple fronts, lose key assets, and shift from territorial control to insurgent terrorism. Without Kenya, al-Shabaab would likely have retained Kismayo longer, maintained stronger financial networks, and enjoyed greater freedom of movement in southern Somalia. That is not speculation. That is supported by pre-2011 assessments from the UN and regional security experts. Kenya forced al-Shabaab to fight a war it did not want. And that is often how wars are changed. As Somalia transitions from AMISOM to ATMIS, and eventually to full Somali security responsibility, Kenya's role remains critical. The long war is not over. But the battlefield today is very different from the one Kenya entered in 2011. And that difference is the KDF's legacy in Somalia. If you want to understand modern African warfare, regional security, and how mid-tier militaries shape conflicts, Kenya versus al-Shabaab is not a side story. It is a case study. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. More deep dive military history and strategy content is coming.